Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Love Encompassed podcast. We hope that you really enjoyed that first one where we just kind of told the story about just us.
Just us.
And it was so cool. We went back and we were watching it, and just all the people that were texting or posting about it. Thank you so much. But we were watching it and we're like, man, there's so much more to that story that we skipped out on.
I know. I think it's one of those things where you told it so many different times that you're like, you forget little pieces. And then when you watch it back, you're like, oh, we forgot to say. So later down the road, we will.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll dive more into it. But thank you so much to all the people. We asked a question on one of our posts that was kind of like, hey, what do you want us to talk about? And we got some great feedback from people. So we want to answer some of that stuff.
Absolutely. And since today we're talking on communication, we thought it would be a good idea to segue into one of the topics that someone had posted on our post, which was the power of communication.
Yeah, communication is the key to everything.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So whether you've got kids or you're single and you're looking for a relationship, or you're married and you've been married for, 2 weeks, 2 years, or 20 years, communication for us is the most important thing.
Yeah, it's really big for me. And like you said, not just in your regular relationships, whether you're married or not. And it's also like for me, it's an important thing, like even in just my regular day-to-day actions.
Yeah, any type of relationship, communication is key. And when communication isn't there, it usually causes a bunch of problems. And we've had some issues when communication hasn't been there, that's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think everybody has, and I think the important thing is like you were saying is like learning how each other communicate in a way to where like you get the best out of it. And so, which is why we're talking about the power of communication today.
Yeah, so with communication, we one time there's a great thing that we used and a lot of people have used before. It's the five love languages.
Hmm.
And I love the five love languages because you can go in and you kind of figure out like how it is. But if you just take the five love languages and then just leave it and don't talk about it,
Hmm.
then it can create some issues. And we took it.
Hmm.
Actually, a funny story is the very first time Victoria ever took it, she was like 8 months pregnant. So she was like, look, I'm all of these five. She's like, I want access
I was
service.
pregnant with a lot of needs.
She's like, I was access service. I was all kinds of stuff. So I was like, well, of course you are. You're pregnant. So, but we took it. And here's what we realized: we were both quality time and we were physical touch.
Yes. And then when we found out, you were like, "Oh, that's awesome. We're the same thing." And I was like, "Yeah, that's awesome." And then I was like, "Wait a minute. What's your definition of quality time and physical touch?" And then that's when we found out our definition of those things were completely different. My definition, or what I viewed as quality time, was I have your undivided attention and you're not doing anything, like it's just me and you. And my physical touch was, holding me while we talk. Yours
Yeah.
was
And so I communicated that my quality time was watching something on TV, a sporting event or anything. I'm really into sports. And she can be sitting next to me without saying a word and just being on her phone and then talking to me at halftime or during commercials. And then I'm a guy. So, of course, my physical touch was not cuddling, it was what happens after cuddling.
yes,
So,
yes, yes.
but here's the thing is, if we did not communicate and talk about it, you put expectations on
Hmm.
somebody, and without talking and communicating those expectations, things can get crazy. Like you
Absolutely.
can get angry, you can get ticked, there's all kinds of
Yeah, and
stuff.
that's what I was gonna say. You have unnecessary frustration because you think you have communicated clearly about something, or maybe not have like asked further questions to get more of an understanding. And so then you leave the conversation thinking that you know what the other person meant, whether it's your spouse, your child, or whomever. And so when they don't follow through with something that you thought you communicated well about, then it leaves frustration for you, and the other person is left confused, or maybe not even know at all because you didn't communicate that. So I know one thing that we like to do, or that we started doing that really helped, is when we did communicate, um, before we left the conversation was like, does that make sense? Do you understand where I'm coming from? So that when we left the conversation, we made sure we were on the same page.
Yeah, I think every time there's communication, we talked about this, is that you have to listen to understand, not to respond. So sometimes, right, you get into fights or you get into arguments or you get into something, and now all of a sudden I'm just waiting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not listening to understand where you're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
I'm listening to be like, oh, you said that wrong about
Mm-hmm.
3 minutes ago, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the only thing I'm going to think about.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as you pause, I'd be like, well, let me go back to, instead of understanding where she's frustrated at or that type of communication, it's more for me. Sometimes I will listen to be like, okay, I got her. When she says this, I
Mm-hmm.
got her. She's like, well, you didn't do this. And I'm like, I did do that 8 months ago.
But even in communicating that, like, sometimes, and I don't know if it's a guy thing or if it's a your thing, but sometimes when someone is coming to you to vent about something, depending on what they're venting about, obviously it's like, I'm not always the best at it, but I try to be like, okay, are you just wanting to vent? Or do you want like some advice? And so I think because your heart is very much so like a, let me fix it.
Right.
Sometimes when I'm like saying something, I can see you're going into fix it mode and I'm just like, hey, I just need you to listen. But if I don't communicate that, then what will happen is in my frustration, eventually I will stop communicating and then it causes more problems down the road. And I'm like, oh, see, he doesn't listen when really it was just a communication, my holding my responsibility on my part and my communicating what I did or did not want in that situation.
Yeah, because that's the thing is, as she's talking, sometimes I think as guys,
Mm,
here's what I think we do as guys. We, as you're talking, we start thinking to ourselves, all right, well, here's what you need to do.
mm,
Boom, boom, boom.
mm-hmm,
And sometimes she's not talking about, or she's not, um, it's not about so much fixing the problem as
mm-hmm.
hearing like her heart behind it. But I can get into such a mode. There was a time she used to tell me all the time, don't pastor me.
Yeah,
Like, stop pastoring me.
yeah,
Because I can just get into a mode where I'm like, okay, well, here's how you fix it.
yeah,
Like, what's the big deal?
right,
And you were like, it's not about it. Quit trying to fix everything
yeah.
all the time. But I think just as guys in general, I think that's just what we do. I think we're just kind of like, all right, well, here's what you do.
So
It's
then
this and this.
here's a question for you, for guys that are that way. Do you have any words of advice to kind of help them find that balance so that, um, you know, they don't always go to that spot?
Yeah, I think that's what you said was spot on. I think having the communication of saying, "Hey, are you wanting feedback? Are you wanting me to help solve the problem? Or are you just venting in frustration right now? And I need to just understand that that's a frustration.
Yeah,
It doesn't mean I have to fix it. It doesn't mean that I have to, okay, well, here's what you're going to do. It simply means I just need to hear you.
right,
And I think sometimes but if you don't talk about that,
right.
and I think that's the thing is with communication, a lot of times, even guys don't talk about it. It's like, there's moments where I feel like insecure.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had to tell you, like, I didn't do it before,
Mm-hmm.
but now I do it and I say, man, I'm feeling insecure,
Right.
which is ironic because I'm so good
I
looking.
mean, you are a head turner. I mean, I'm just saying.
But I think that's what we don't talk about it.
Hmm.
So we assume the other person already knows.
Yeah. And as far as you were saying, as like, it took you a minute to get to that place of, hey, I'm communicating my feelings. And I know sometimes as a guy, maybe even sometimes as women, we're slow to do that. And so I would want to, for me, it was a situation where when I recognized you started doing that, I was okay, there's a reason why, whether it's, that's something you were taught, that's how you grew up or whatever the case may be. But at the end of the day, I think that if we as people don't provide a safe place for someone to be able to communicate, they're not going to, especially when it comes to their emotions and feelings. So when I even remember when I recognized it and I asked you, I was like, hey, I noticed, like, I tell you how I feel and my emotions, but I noticed that you don't. Why is that? And that's when you explain, my childhood, what I grew up with, my past, different things in that nature. And so I took that as, okay, with that understanding, I need to make sure that I create a safe environment, a safe space for him to be able to share. And that when he does have that moment and he is sharing, not to attack, not to, come after him or whatever the case may be, because I want him to know that he can feel more comfortable and trust that he can trust his emotions with me and I'm not going to mishandle it. And I think it's the same way as guys with women. Sometimes women stop communicating to guys when we feel like there's no longer that safe space or place to share what we're feeling, whether you're going to fix it, whether you don't listen, whether you're going to judge. And so I know sometimes it's like, that's why it's really, not sometimes, but really that's why it's important to um, make sure you're aware of that and make sure that you are intentional about creating that safe space for your partner, whether it's for your partner and for your child or a friend.
Yeah. Because the thing is if you don't have that communication, I think that even for guys, guys and probably women too, it's the same token as what you were saying of, hey, if I feel like you're not listening to me,
Mm-hmm.
then it's just shutdown mode.
For sure. And your heart becomes closed off. And the hard part is you want to communicate like your
Right.
frustration, but
Right.
because of the experience that you've now experience tells me I can't do that with you. But the challenge is like we're gonna kind of keep going in this circle where I'm frustrated. I'm not communicating. Now things are starting to get built up. Now there's resentment. Now it's like this domino effect because we stop communicating because of the other person or vice versa. And so we still have to find a way, and as frustrating as hard as it is, I do believe we still have to find a way to not communicate because it solves nothing um if you do stop
Right. And
communicating.
because what ends up happening, it just festers
Mm-hmm.
and like time goes. So then it just goes down to the bottom, like, just kind of settles. Then something else happens and something else happens. And I'm sure people, it's relationships with friends or relationships with spouses or whatever, wherever you're at. And then something happens and it becomes a blow up.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're like, what are you freaking out about
Right.
this for? This is so minor, but it's not that. It's something else that's farther down the road.
Mm-hmm.
And which brings me to my next thing on communication is fighting fair
Yeah.
because everybody fights. Everybody, whether you're in a marriage or you're just friends,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to have disagreements.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you fight fair?
Yeah. For me, because of my experience, watching my parents when I was growing up, sometimes when they would get into it, it would get really, really intense. And I remember how it made me feel, when that would happen. And so when I became an adult, I was very intentional about, okay, as an adult, I should be able to communicate my emotions effectively and in a way to where there is some understanding. And so for me in fighting fair is I try to, whenever I'm coming with you with something, whether it's you or the boys or whatever, I try to express it in a way to where that person can understand where I'm coming from.
Right.
Um, and then at the end of that, I will ask them, does that make sense? Or can you see where I'm coming from? Or if you were in my situation, can you understand um where I'm coming from?
Yeah, because when we first got together, I had lived on my own for a while, just, going through, and sometimes you don't see your own blind spots when you're by yourself. Then when we first got together, I was very much, I'm kind of like I can get flash mad.
Mm.
And then it's like 3 minutes later, I'm over it. I'm ready to move on. It's no big deal for me. Everything's fine. Victoria is more of an internal processor. And so she thinks about it for a while. I'm kind of just in the moment and then it's over. And there was a few times when we got married, when we first got married, I was like, you know,
Intense.
intense. And then you would be like, just shut down. And I'm
Well,
like, well, then let's. I don't
right.
want to keep talking. Why are you not talking to me? And that
Well,
would make
yeah.
me angrier.
Well, yeah. So our first, because I remember our first, we riding your truck. Um, our first time having a quote unquote disagreement, you were like on 10, and because of my new mind, not my new mindset, but because of my mindset from my experience growing up, I was like, as an adult, I feel like we can communicate effectively without yelling at each other, because yelling causes like no good, like in that way of communicating. And so I remember when you started going in, I stopped talking, and it quieted him, and he was just like, "Why aren't you blah blah blah?" And I was like, "Because I feel like we're adults, and I feel like as adults we should be able to communicate what we were feeling or our frustrations
Oh,
without
they
going
used
to
to make
10."
me so
And
mad
it
when we
like
first
it
got
did. He was like,
together.
"No, we're gonna blah
I'm
blah
like, are
blah
you
blah."
trying to tell me I'm not an adult?
I know. And thinking about that, going back, I could see how he would take it that way. I could see how and so I look back on that, and I probably could have communicated that a little differently so that was received better. But all I was just trying to say was, hey, yelling's not going to do anything, and I'm not going to go there with you. We should be able to come to a resolution about this situation with some, like, you know, adultness.
Well, I think that's where we got to the spot in our marriage where we said, hey, which I think is a key for everybody in relationships, right? When it's getting to that moment
Hmm.
and you cannot be level headed,
Right.
right? You have to be okay with saying, hey, we need to take a step back for a second. We need to calm down to
Hmm.
where we can talk in a level, normal tone and talk like an adult and then come back to having this conversation. But I think sometimes what happens, we talk to couples all the time and they'll do that, but then they don't come back
Right.
to have the conversation.
Right.
Like you
Because,
still have to address whatever it is you had a
right.
disagreement. You can't be married to somebody or be friends with people for a long period of time and not have disagreements. That's
Right.
part of life.
Right. And, to piggyback off of that, um, it's okay to say in that moment when things are escalating, because at the end of the day, do you want to be right or do you want resolution? And
Mm.
so for us, what we like to do is, like, whether it's whatever, when we feel ourselves getting worked up, and at this point, because when your emotions are high and you're, yelling or whatever the case may be, at that point, are you really listening to each other, or are you
No,
just exploding,
not at
right?
all.
And so at that point, you're really not no longer articulating what you're feeling, because you're so upset and emotions are so high. And now at that point, you kind of get in defense mode, right? So when we feel like it's starting to get a little intense, it's not that we're not addressing what is. It's just that we've recognized, okay, we're in a spot where we're no longer processing what the other person is saying. Now we're starting to get a little emotional about it. And
Yep.
we'll say that, hey, I'm starting to get really upset.
Yep.
Let me calm down. It's probably more me than you.
Yeah, I was about to say, this is what she says, not what I say.
Let me calm down, because I need to process this. Let me, like, whatever. And I don't take days on days on days, I make sure that I, like, once I have calmed down and, like, okay, Victoria, like, what's really going on? And sometimes I'll have to ask myself, why are you really getting upset? Why are
Yeah,
you
that's what
really
I was
getting
going to say.
frustrated?
Most of the time, it's not even
Right.
about that thing. Most of the time, it's about other things that have
Mhm.
happened. You're frustrated at the kids, or you're
Mhm.
frustrated at your job, or
Mhm.
you're frustrated at something, and it's led up to
Mhm.
something so
Oh,
minor.
for sure. Or a fear pops up that doesn't really mean what's happening, right? It could be a fear of, like, for example, if you're saying, "Hey, we're going to do this or that or the other," and a fear pops up that, I took it as something else, and then that is what is responding, instead of me actually responding to what you actually said, instead of the emotion that I felt from it.
Right. And I think we've we've gotten to a spot. I'm not saying we started out
Oh my
like
gosh,
this is how
no.
we did it. I think we just got to a spot where we now communicate those things.
Yeah.
Like, hey, this is an insecurity that I
Right.
have. Everybody has them. And it's like, okay, this is an insecurity that I have. Here's what's happening. And we just talk about it. I do think that goes back a lot to how we started when we
Mhm.
were just friends for
Right.
so long. We just talked about everything and it was
Right.
easy to talk to each other. And then I think as we've, more years in
Mhm.
marriage and everything else, I think we're just more comfortable with sharing. And you have to be, but you've got to be more comfortable in sharing, like, hey, this is a fear, this is an
Right.
insecurity. If you don't communicate that stuff,
Right.
you'll never grow.
Right. And that goes back to um what I had said before, which is we want the resolution not to be right.
Yes.
And we got to a place where we understood the importance of creating a safe space for that to happen. And one thing that helped me with, because I was a little, I would be honest and say, because of past experience from childhood or whatever the case may be, I didn't process things well when we would get in a disagreement. I would tend to shut down for days and not talk, not because I was trying to be rude toward him, but because at the time I didn't know how to process my emotions and how something made me feel. And as time went on and I healed through that, I also think that one thing that helped me as well was, like, at the end of the day, I don't see you just as my best friend or just as my husband. The way I believe that God kind of downloaded in my heart was like a team. We're a team.
Yeah.
And so us communicating, us growing, us learning each other is for the betterment of the team, not for just a selfish thing. Well, I'm trying to be right. It's about us as a team. And because I respect you as a person, I want you to be heard. I want you to feel safe. And I think that ties back into making sure that we are respecting those that we have relationship with.
Yeah. And it's, I love the team aspect, it's really the Bible. Like we're helpmates, right? So there's things that I'm gonna be good at that you're not as good at, and vice versa. You're gonna be great at things that I'm not good at, and I think that is what you play off of, and you get to an understanding in your
Mm-hmm.
lives that you're just like, hey, you're good at that. That's what you're. We joke all the time about our boys. Our boys are amazing, but
Mm-hmm.
they'll open up to you like crazy.
Yeah.
With me, we talk sports
Yeah.
and they'll talk to me too, but it's they're way more open with you, but you have that natural, hey, come and talk to me. What's going on? You
Thanks.
ask way more questions
Yeah.
than I do. I'm like, you good?
Eh.
Yeah. All right, cool. And you'll be like, you good? Yeah. You don't seem good.
Yeah.
What's going on?
I think part of that came from, and I know go back to childhood, but I think part of that came back like with being a middle child and being in situations that I think part of it is how I am, but I think the other part of it is being a middle child. And I tended to kind of like step back and I would like, you know, watch, particular people or whatever environments and different things like that. And I just kind of learned how to pick up when someone was bothered by something or whatever.
Nice.
But I also think it's because I didn't feel when I was younger like heard. So now when I talk to people, I want to make sure they feel heard. And I don't want to assume. So I ask questions. Well, why is that? And how do you feel? Or hey, I feel like, and I think also as a parent, for the boy situation, as a parent, as a mom, I could just pick up like something's off. But I think outside of that, I just want to make sure someone feels heard and being intentional about it.
Yeah. So it's when you're in a relationship and you're communicating,
Mm-hmm.
what do you do when you feel like, hey, I am communicating? Because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people will ask us, they're like, I am communicating, and they're not listening. They're not, you know, I'm sure I've been that way maybe
Yeah.
once in 18 years of
Yeah.
marriage. Maybe I've only not listened once.
Yeah.
And so, but how do you deal with that from a woman's standpoint? Let's say, hey, my spouse or whatever, I've been trying to communicate these problems or these feelings, and it seems like they're just kind of blowing them off.
Yeah. So I know every guy is different, but what has helped me is, I do believe in God and and I am have a relationship with him. And so when I felt like I have came to you, and it was more in the beginning, but when I felt like I came to you over and over, like, bro, like, and I would leave frustrated at times, I just got to a point where I was like, okay, I'm just going to start going to God about it. And I would just tell God, like, hey, this is what I'm feeling. He's not listening. I've expressed this I don't know how many times. And without fail, in my experience, you would always come back and be like, hey, God was really dealing with me about this
Yeah.
and that and the other. Um, as time has gone by and as we've been, married longer, now if you do that, I will let it breathe for a little bit, especially if I start getting frustrated. I will let it breathe for a little bit. And then when I do come back to him, I will express, hey, I feel like I've expressed this particular thing to you multiple number of times. And at this point, it is beginning to frustrate me because I feel like you're not listening. And so I think you do a really good job when you hear that. You're like, okay, let me, whatever. So I think that if you have communicated over and over again, like I will let it breathe for a little bit and then try to go back to that person and then express to them why it's frustrating you. Maybe use a scenario of like something they really care about so that they can understand and get it. Because sometimes people just aren't emotionally intelligent and they just don't get it.
Yes.
So I would say try to find something that they find really important, hold dear to where it will click for them. Oh, okay. I see what you're saying now. And see if that works. What do you do? What would you say?
Um, I would say if I've tried to communicate something and it's fallen on deaf ears, again, I think it's knowing yourself. I think before I would be just blow up or whatever. Um, I think now more, I think that I bring it to you similar. I
Mhm.
think I go to God first and try to figure out like, hey, what's the best route to do
Right.
this? And then I think there's other times after that's over, then I think I just come back and I'm like, hey, these are the things that are kind of bothering me.
Mhm.
Um, I just need you to hear me out
Mhm.
or tell me what you think or
Mhm.
whatever it is. And most of the time, I would say most of the time when we do talk about it, as we're talking about it, here's what I love about communication. In my opinion, I feel like that as you're talking about stuff, you
Mhm.
can start to see how you are mishandling things.
Mm.
Does that make sense? Like you
Absolutely.
start talking about it and then you're like, why did I get
Yeah.
this, upset over something that
Right.
doesn't need to be upset over?
I think that comes from just being emotionally aware. I think it comes from being emotionally aware, but I think it also comes from being aware of self. Like, one of the things that really helped me to do that is when it was you who helped me do it, is like I would get
Yeah.
frustrated.
Say that again though,
Yeah,
so
it was you,
everybody
boo.
knows. Thank
It
you.
was you. But it wasn't nothing to do with him. It was a situation that I was dealing with when I was working at this one particular place at the time. And oh my gosh, the person that I was working for was just sending me. And so I remember you saying, like, hey, what you should do is take a journal to work. And when a situation happens and you react to it or it makes you feel a certain type of way, write down what happened, how you responded, and why you responded that way. And I think when I started doing that, I just started kind of using that with everything. And so as a result, I feel like that's kind of what helped me become more emotionally aware and be like, "Oh, hey, Victoria, you're not always right," which is hard to believe.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you're not
I'm
always right.
surprised you admitted that on a podcast. So I may play that clip over and over. I'm gonna put that one on social media for people to see.
You have evidence. But I think in doing that kind of helped me to become more aware. So I think in general, where however you get to that space, I think when we become intentional about aware of self, then I think you can be more open to hearing someone in a conversation because it goes like also back to because I respect this person, I care about this person, I love this person, again, spouse, friend, child.
Right.
Let me not automatically assume and think I'm right or whatever the case may be. Let me be open to the possibility
Mm, that you could be wrong.
that you could be wrong or that you could have offended. I think sometimes we're so focused at times on what was done to us and how we weren't heard. But is there a possibility that I could have been that way towards somebody else? And so I think in realizing, okay, well, let me extend grace to that other person like I've been extended grace.
Uh, I have I have sat with couples before and just tried to help or whatever, and nothing is worse than when you have one of the either the husband or the wife or whoever, and they're always right.
Yeah.
Like they're the ones who knows what to do all the time. They're the one that knows this. And it drives me. crazy. I'm like, well, maybe, maybe you handled that
Mhm.
situation wrong. And they're so defiant in the sense of like, no, I can't see how I would have done any of that,
Wow.
and you're like, nobody handles every
Mm-mm.
situation perfectly because nobody is perfect.
Mm-mm.
Everybody has blind spots. Everybody.
Mhm.
And if you don't have the right people around you
Mhm.
that will speak into those blind spots and communicate them to you,
And you be
like,
open to receiving that.
yes, it's like, dude, and we do that with our kids because there's
Yeah.
times that we'll get on them and it's like, I've texted you and I'm like, is that too strong? And
Mhm.
there's times that you're like, yeah, you probably were coming on too strong. There's other times Victoria's like, no, not strong enough. You should have, you got to do that sometimes. And vice versa. She'll be like, hey, do you think that I came on? And I'm like, no. Or, yeah, you seem like you're like snapping at him a little bit much. But if you constantly are always right, I would encourage you to take a look at yourself because there's nobody who's always right.
Well, I would say check your pride
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
because I think that's what it is. I think it's pride and respectfully, I think it's selfishness. When you are so caught up in your world and your bubble that you don't see the possibility that you didn't have some part in the play, I think it's pride and selfishness.
Yeah, because if if you can't see, I've said this, in every disagreement that you may have with your spouse or somebody, there is always something that you can do better.
Oh, for sure.
There's always something, even when you're right. It could be the way in which you presented it of
Mhm.
being right or whatever it is. But there's always something. If you can take away and say, okay, what can I do better than next time?
Mhm.
Because I'm a firm believer in I'm totally cool with confrontation.
Oh, for sure.
I have no problem with confrontation whatsoever.
Yeah.
But I do believe that confrontation without resolution will cause chaos.
Mhm.
And so I think that you have to confront it. And you also have to understand, like, in that confrontation, what could you have done better?
Mhm.
What could you have said that maybe wasn't as harsh or
Right.
wasn't as critical or whatever it is,
Right.
instead of just being like, oh, no, I was right.
Right. For sure. And I think when you have recognized it, taking it a step farther is going back and apologizing.
Ooh, yeah.
And here's the big one that was for me. Going even if it's like we have two teenagers, even if it's our
Oh,
teenagers. And
yeah.
I remember the first time I did that with Brandon, that's our oldest. Um he was like 7. And he was, being a 7-year-old. And I just kind of like, went for him. Not in a like, I wasn't like abusive or anything like that. I just yelled at him really intensely. And I remember when he came back to me and he was just like, Mom, can we talk? And I was like, well, 7-year-old, okay, let's do this. And so he was just like, the way you yelled at me really hurt my feelings. Now, I could have boasted in that moment and said, well, I'm your mama and I can talk to you any kind of way because
Word.
you did XYZ. Or what I chose to do was, okay, I want to make sure, excuse me, I want to make sure he feels heard. Was I right in correcting the behavior? Yes. But I wanted to make sure he felt heard while um all the more like helping him understand why the correction needed to be had. So basically, what I did was, okay, well, first of all, Brandon, thank you so much for communicating what you were feeling. It was not my intention to make you feel XYZ, and I apologize for that. Let me help you understand why you got in trouble with this particular thing. So I acknowledged what he was feeling. I let him know that he was heard, but I still communicated why he got in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. And communication goes to everything,
Yeah.
really, right? If it's like when we first got together, I'm really into sports and I would play softball like all the time. And Victoria does not like the outside. She likes the outside,
If it's a beach.
right? And there's no bugs around and
Right.
there's nothing else.
Right.
So she came to a softball game and then it was at night.
Oh, when we
Eh,
were dating. Yes, I
Yeah.
remember that because of the
And
bugs.
yeah. And then she had to communicate and say, listen, I like you.
I
Um,
said, I love you.
yeah, she said, I love you, but I
This
don't
ain't for
love
me.
this.
This ain't for me.
And you can get upset by that, or you can say, hey, I understand
Yeah.
that's not your person. That's not what you're into. It doesn't mean that that's wrong. It just
Mm-mm.
simply means that's not what you're into. And so I was like, yeah, totally cool. And she would every once in a while,
Right.
she would come to the game or
Right.
whatever. But for the most part, she's like, hey, hit me up as soon as you get home.
Right. Because I didn't want to be like, hey, this isn't for me. And so because this isn't for me, but yet you find this important to you for me to be here, I'm good. Like I didn't want to be like that. I still wanted to communicate. This isn't for me. Can we find a common ground
Ooh, compromise.
to where I do a little bit, but not every time? And you know my heart because I love you.
Right. Which is really communicating to compromise, right? And so you do have to compromise in marriage. It's not all about you. If everything is all about you, again,
Right.
it's not going to be very happy
Mm-mm.
at all. Somebody's not going to be happy if it's all about them. You know, we were talking to people recently, and I said, waking up every morning when you're married, and this is good if you're single too, just so you're preparing to get married or finding somebody. If you can wake up every morning as the spouses and you are constantly thinking of the other person and what can make their day better, if you're both doing that, you'll have a great marriage.
Yeah, and I think it's to piggyback off of that, I think basically what you're doing is that you are doing like little love deposits for them. And I think what happens when we don't receive it, as far as the love deposits go, and you're constantly taking, eventually that is going to be depleted, and that person is going to feel emotionally depleted from you
Mm-hmm.
because you're not being intentional with each other and trying to do the deposits. And that again doesn't just go for, I feel, with relationships as far as marriage goes. I think that goes with your children. I think that goes with your friends. I think that goes with, those relationships outside of it.
Yeah. Everybody you have to be depositing in. If it's constant withdrawals, then it's going to be tough, you know? And again, the topic for today was communication. And we're hoping that you got some tips. We're hoping that you learn from it. We'd love to hear your feedback on it. Let us know. Tell
Yeah.
us like, hey, that was good. I
Yeah.
get it. Or hey, this part of communication I'd love to talk more about.
And before we go, I want you to talk about something that you have talked about a lot is how not everything is a thing.
Yeah. So it's what I say a lot, right? Not everything is a thing. Not everything has to be addressed. Not everything. Should you communicate? Absolutely in marriage. Should you communicate as friends? Everything. But sometimes you got to just grace people.
Yeah.
People just have rough days. People just have hard times. They're going through stress. You never know what everybody's going through. And so sometimes you just have to grace people.
Yeah.
And sometimes, being married, you just wake up it's true. You just wake up not angry, but you're just annoyed or you're just frustrated or you didn't
Irritated.
sleep good. Yeah, you're irritated and maybe you have a spouse that snores and now all of a
What?
sudden now all of a sudden it's like they snored, they got, whatever, and you didn't get good sleep last night. Well, now all of a sudden you're mad and you're frustrated, but you have to look at that and realize, okay, everything that happens in the day is not a thing.
No, and I like to look at that too as twofold. One, um, if I am feeling a little more irritated or I know that I am in a bad mood, I don't fall in the excuse of, well, I'm in a bad mood. I'm irritated. I don't do that only because I'm like, okay, well, that's not very mature. That's not adulting. And so I will be like, okay, Victoria, if you know you in a bad mood, then you need to own up to that and either like distance yourself until you get it together or you need to communicate that like, hey, I apologize today. I'm like kind of like my patience is not where it needs to be. So if I, whatever, I apologize in advance. But don't just like throw caution to the wind about it. And the other thing that I like to do, excuse me, I had to tickle my throat. The other thing that I like to do is I have to ask myself with the whole everything's not a thing, like if like how upset am I about this, right? Like Victoria, on a scale from 1 to 10, like if this doesn't get any resolution, like is it really gonna bother you? Is it really that deep? no, girl, let it go. It ain't that deep. Like, keep it moving. But if it does really, really bother me, that's when I'm like, okay, I need to talk about this.
Yeah, if it's if love can't cover it, then you have to confront it.
Mm,
So if you just can't look it over and be like, all right, man, just chalk it up, bad day, whatever it is, it happens, cool. But if it's something that you love can't cover over it, then you need to address.
yeah,
And not everything has to be addressed. It just doesn't have to be addressed. And the way you address it is important. What you say is important. The words you're using, we're real big about it not using never and always because those are just words. It's not true.
right.
You can't say, "Well, you never do this." Never.
Yeah,
I do it
yeah,
sometimes, right? It's
yeah,
just in this moment I'm not doing it.
yeah,
And so we're real big about not using those words.
yeah.
And so I think just communicating,
Mm-hmm.
making sure that the person feels heard,
Yeah,
making sure that you are expressing it. Again, if it doesn't, if love can't cover it, you got to confront it.
right. And if you love your partner, which I'm sure a lot of you guys do, or that relationship to you is really, really important. I think you should go the extra mile in making sure, like, oh, because I love this person, I want to make sure they have a safe space. I want to make sure they feel heard. And like I said, it's not even just with loving the person that you're in a relationship with, or your child, or whomever. There are a lot of people out there that are hurting and don't feel heard. So if you have someone like for off chances, like, whoa, where is this coming from? They were kind of spilling their, whole life on me. I think unless it's like toxic and you're like, okay, this is too much, allow them to feel that because they may not have that in their lives and you don't know how much of a blessing that could be to someone. But also in that communicating, if you are going to bring something to someone, and I do this with the boys or with you or whomever, I will preface it with like, okay, Victoria, how can I say this? Because I used to just like say it like, hey, I just tell it like it is, but that's not nice.
No, it's not.
So my growth in that area was, okay, Victoria, sometimes I will preface the conversation in my head, okay, how can I say this in a way that they receive it? And then I will go to the person and I will start off with something like, hey, I want to talk to you about something, or hey, I'm not trying to come at you, wherever the case may be. And, then go in and you'll be surprised, I feel in my experience, how well someone receives something in that way
Yeah.
because they don't feel like they're being attacked.
Yeah. If you are going to put somebody, when you come at somebody immediately, it automatically puts people on the defensive. And I even say this like when you're dealing with people, we say it in our marriage all the time is, hey, the way you're coming across.
Mm,
So, like, the way you're coming across is attacking, or
mm,
the way you're coming across is making it seem like I'm an idiot.
mm.
And the reason why you say that is because maybe then looking on the bright side or looking in the positive form of people, maybe they're not trying to make you feel that way,
Right.
or maybe they are. But if you just get into, hey, you're attacking me, you make me feel like an idiot. But
Mhm.
now all of a sudden, everybody's guards up,
Mhm.
everybody's on the defensive,
Mhm.
everybody's yelling. So it's like, hey, the way that's coming across
Right.
is this way.
Right. And I feel like the response to that isn't, well, that's not my problem.
Mm,
You know, that because that's not how I said it. Well, that doesn't work either. So what
right.
I like to do is I say, okay, well, that's definitely not my intention. And that's not how I'm trying to come off. So I apologize if that is how it's coming off. This is all I'm just trying to say.
Right.
Just to
Right.
kind of clear the air, like, hey, I'm not trying to attack you. And again, it goes back into letting their defense come down. But again, the goal is resolution. The goal is, hey, we're trying to have clear communication and understanding so that we can, get to that resolution. It is not about I'm right, you're wrong, and you got to pay for it, or this is what you did to me. No, because the purpose of communicating is for resolution or for understanding.
Yep. 100%. Man, this is good today.
Hopefully they enjoyed it.
Man, I did. Just even talking about it. So, listen, thank you so much for subscribing, for following, for those that have posted about it and everything else. We really do appreciate it. Tell your friends about it. And, it's just an exciting, we want to hear from you too. So let us know, like, hey, we want you guys to talk about this or we want you to talk about that. We're trust me when I tell you there's no subjects that's off limits for us.
Absolutely not. And as we continue in the podcast, we're going to continue to be vulnerable and like, share our experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we're really grateful that you guys are here. And if this helped you, we ask that share it with a friend, and if you haven't already, subscribed and give us a follow.
Yep. So thank you so much for joining us on today's podcast. We can't wait to see you next week on the Love Encompass podcast. Follow us on Instagram. You can subscribe on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify.
Until then, see you later.
See ya.